Hello everyone, welcome back to my English class. I am Jyoti Singh and today we will continue the chapter Silk Road from the book Hornbill of Standard 11th, and this chapter is written by Nick Middleton. In this story we already read about Nick Middleton's or the narrator's journey, his journey from slopes of Rabu to Mount Kailash to complete the Kora. To bid him farewell, Lahamo gave him a long-sleeved sheepskin coat. He hired Teston's car for his journey and took Daniel along to escort him to Darchan. So this is the introduction, and let's start the story where we left. By late afternoon, we had reached the small town of Hor, back on the main east-west highway that followed the old trade route from Lhasa to Kashmir. Daniel, who was returning to Lhasa, found a ride in a truck, so Satan and I bade him farewell outside a tire repair shop. We had suffered two punctures in quick succession on the drive down from the Salt Lake, and Satan was eager to have them fixed since they left him up with no spares. Besides, the second tire he had changed had been replaced by one that was as smooth as my bald head. Now, here are some word meanings. Careered down, it means sinking the slope, and salt flats means thatched roof covered with snow, and pockmarked, it means disfigured with a scar, and brackish means slightly salty water. Vestige means a trace of something that is disappearing, and laden means loaded. Then, by the late afternoon, they reached Hor town. Hor is the name of a place, and back to the east-west highway, which was an old route from Lhasa to Kashmir. Daniel found a ride as he was on his way back to Lhasa. Both of them bid him farewell as tire repair shop. Their car suffered two punctures on the way from the Salt Lake, so Saturn was eager to get them fixed. They had no spare tire left, and the second tire, which he changed, was replaced by a smooth tire just like the head of the protagonist. Hor. Hor was a grim, miserable place. There was no vegetation whatsoever, just dust and rocks, liberally scattered with years of accumulated refuse, which was unfortunate given that the town sat on the shore of Lake Mansarovar, Tibet's most venerated stretch of water. Ancient Hindu and Buddhist cosmology pinpoints Mansarovar as the source of four great Indian rivers: the Indus, the Ganges, the Satluj, and the Brahmaputra. Actually, only the Satluj flows from the lake, but the headwaters of the others all rise nearby on the flanks of Mount Kailash. We were within striking distance of the great mountain, and I was eager to forge ahead. But I had to wait. Saturn told me to go and drink some tea in Horse only cafe, which, like all the other buildings in town, was constructed from badly painted concrete and had three broken windows. The good way of the lake through one of them helped to compensate for the drought. Word meanings for you. Grim, it means ugly or grey when something is ugly. Accumulated, it means gathered, and venerated means respected. Cosmology means science about the origin and development of the universe, and flanks, it means sides, and folds, it means put together. built up. Further, Hor is described in this paragraph. Hor, which was an ugly and miserable place, which had no vegetation. Hor is the place which is scattered with gathered refuse, and it was luckless. And that was on the shore of Lake Mansarovar, which is Tibet's most respected water. According to ancient Hindu and Buddhist cosmologists, it consists of four Indian rivers: the Indus, the Ganges, the Satluj, and the Brahmaputra. Satluj River flows from this lake, and other three rivers rise near the sides of Mount Kailas. They were in a remarkable distance, and he was eager to build ahead. He waited for Saturn while having some tea at Horse Cafe, which was constructed badly from painted concrete and three broken windows, although it had a good view of the lake. Next, I was served by a Chinese youth in military uniform who spread the grease around on my table with a filthy rag before bringing me a glass and a thermos of tea. Filthy means dirty. Half an hour later, Saturn relieved me from my solitary confinement, and we drove past a lot more rocks and rubbish westwards, out of town towards Mount Kailas. My experience in Hor came as a stark contrast to accounts I had read of earlier travelers. First encounters with Lake Mansarovar, Ekai Kawaguchi, a Japanese monk who had arrived there in 1900, was so moved by the sanctity of the lake that he burst into tears. A couple of years later, he hallowed waters and had a similar effect on Sven Hedin, a Swede who wasn't prone to sentimental outbursts. Filthy means dirty, and drag means scrap claws, and solitary means private, or you can say alone, and confinement, it means captivity, and stark means plain, sanctuary means pure. Further, it was dark by the time Further, the narrator was served by a Chinese boy who was wearing a military uniform. He spread the grease around his table with a dirty cloth and brought him a glass and a thermos of tea. Saturn freed him from his private detention, and they started their journey ahead, passing more rocks and rubbish. Then the narrator experiences then narrator's experience was opposite from what he read on first travelers first encounter of the town. Ekai Kuwaguchi, who was a Japanese monk, arrived in 1900, and he was so moved with the purity of the lake that he cried. His eyes were full of tears. After a few years, similar effect was on Sven Hedin, a Swedish who didn't have such an emotional outburst. Then it was dark by the time we finally left again, and after 10:30 p.m. we drew up outside a guest house in Darchin for what turned out to be another troubled night. And they reached at Darchin about 10:30 p.m. and they reside in a guest house. Kicking around in the open air, rubbish dump that passed for the town of Hor had set off my cold once more, and the narrator suffered from the cold because of the dust of Hor. Though, if truth be told, it had never quite disappeared with my herbal tree. and his headache was not cured by the herbal tea. One of my nostrils was blocked again, and as I lay down to sleep, as the narrator tried to sleep, his nostril blocked. I wasn't convinced that the other would provide me with sufficient oxygen, and he feels that the second one nostril was not able to provide sufficient oxygen. My watch told me I was at 4,760 meters. When he looked out his watch, it seems it was told that he was 4,760 meters above. It wasn't much higher than Ravu, and there I had been gasping for oxygen several times every night, and every night he was suffered for oxygen. I had grown accustomed to these nocturnal disturbances by now, but they still scared me. Then he was familiar to these night disturbances and he was scared this time. Tired and hungry, I started breathing through my mouth. He started breathing from his mouth. He was tired and hungry. After a while, I switched to single nostril power, which seemed to be admitting enough oxygen, but just as I was drifting off, I woke up abruptly. As he switched back to breathing from single nostril, and as soon as he was about to sleep, he would wake up shortly because he was not feeling well, as his chest felt heavy, and he sat up and it cleared his nasal passage. He was curious. Something was wrong. My chest felt strangely heavy, and I sat up, a movement that cleared my nasal passage almost instantly and relieved the feeling in my chest. Curious, I thought. The next nocturnal means night time. Next, I lay back down and tried again. Again, when he tried to lay down, same result. It happened again. I was on the point of disappearing into the land of Nod when something told me not to. And then he felt the something. He was in the land of signals where something told him not to do it. It must have been those emergency electrical impulses again, but this was not the same as on previous occasions. He wasn't able to go to sleep this time. This time, I wasn't gasping for breath. I was simply not allowed to go to sleep. And that time, he was not gasping for breath. He was simply allowed to go to sleep. Sitting up once more immediately made me feel better. When he get up, it feels better. I could breathe freely and my chest felt fine. And that time he could breathe freely and his chest had felt good. But as soon as I lay down, my sinuses filled and my chest was odd. But as he tried to lay down, his sinuses had filled and his chest was odd. I tried propping myself upright against the wall, but now I couldn't manage to relax enough to drop off. And he was tried he tried propping himself upright against the wall, but then he couldn't manage to relax enough to drop off. I couldn't put my finger on the reason, but I was afraid to go to sleep. He could not put his finger on the reason, but he was afraid to go to sleep. A little voice inside me was saying that if I did, I might never wake up again. So I stayed awake all night. And after then that, he thought that there is a voice inside the heart. It was saying that if he slept that night, it may happen that he never wake up. Propping means to hold up. He might die if he would try to sleep. So he stayed awake all night. Further, Saturn took me to the Darchen Medical College the following morning. The medical college at Darchen was new and looked like a monastery from the outside, with a very solid door that led into a large courtyard. On the next day, Saturn, who was the driver of the narrator, took him to the Darchen Medical College, and this medical college at Darchen was new and it looked like a monastery from the outside, with a very solid door and that led into a large courtyard, and it has a large courtyard. We found the consulting room, which was dark and cold and occupied by a Tibetan doctor who wore none of the paraphernalia that I had been accepting. And in this medical college, Saturn and the narrator found the consulting room, which was dark, and the room was dark and cold, and it occupied a Tibetan doctor. The doctor, who was in uh, not in the proper uniform of a doctor. He was expecting that he had miscellaneous articles which he had been expected. No white coat, he looked like any other Tibetan, with a thick pullover and a woolly hat. He looked like another Tibetan persons, with a thick pullover and a woolly hat. When I, when I explained my sleepless symptoms, my sudden aversion to laying down, he shot me a few questions while feeling the veins in my wrist. The Tibetan doctor asked the narrator some questions when he feels his veins. It is cold, he said finally through Saturn. The doctor said to the Saturn, it is cold, a cold and the effects of altitude. And then he said that these are the effects of higher altitude. I will give you something for it. I asked him if he thought I would recover enough to be able to do the Kora. Oh yes, he said, you will be fine. Then the doctor told him that he would give him something for this cold. And the narrator asked him if he thought he would recover enough to do and he will be able to do the Kora. And the doctor replied, of course, you the narrator will be fine by taking medicines on time. I walked out of the medical college clutching a brown envelope stuffed with 15 screws of paper. I had a 5-day course of Tibetan medicine which I started right away. The Tibetan doctor gave the narrator a 5-day course. He came out with a brown envelope which had 15 screws of paper. I opened an after breakfast package and found it contained a brown powder that I had to take with hot water. And after having breakfast, he opened the after breakfast package which had a brown powder which he had to take with hot water. It tasted just like cinnamon. and it tastes like a cinnamon, and the the content of the lunchtime and bedtime packages were less obviously identifiable. Both contained small, spherical brown pellets. They looked suspiciously like sheep dung, but of course I took them. That night, after my first full day's course, I slept very soundly, like a lodge, not a dead man. And then the narrator narrates narrated that the lunchtime and bedtime packages were nearly the same. They looked like sheep dung and both had small spherical brown packages. After taking the full day medicine course, he slept peacefully on that night. Once he saw that I was going to leave, Saturn left me to return to Lhasa. As a Buddhist, he told me, he knew that it didn't really matter if I passed away, but he thought it would be bad for business. Then Saturn left him in Darjen when he came to know that he is going to be fine. He told him as a Buddhist that if he had passed away, it would not matter, but it would be bad for business. Once Darchen didn't look so horrible after a good night's sleep. It was still busty, partial derelict, and punctuated by heaps of rubble and refuse. But the sun shone brilliantly in a clear blue sky, and the outlook across the plain to the south gave me a vision of the Himalayas, commanded by a huge snow capped mountain, Gurla Mandhata, with just a wisp of cloud suspended over its summit, and pallets me shone. Further, the next day, Darchen, the narrator said, it wasn't looking so bad. It was dusty, which was dusty. Darchen was dusty and partially ruined and had lots of rubble and refuse everywhere. The brightly shining sun in the blue sky gave him the vision of Himalayas. Gulla Mandhata. He was able to see a little bit with clouds suspended over it. The town had a couple of rudimentary, means basic, general stores selling Chinese cigarettes. In their town, it had a couple of basic general stores, and these shops selling some Chinese cigarettes, soap, and other basic provisions, as well as the usual string of prayer flags. In front of one, men gathered in the afternoon for a game of pool, the battered table looking supremely incongruous in the open air, while nearby women washed their long hair in the icy water of a narrow brook that babbled down past my guest house. Darchen felt relaxed and unhurried, but for me, it came with a significant drawback. There were no pilgrims. Now then, rudimentary means basic and incongruous means strange. Further, Darchin, every afternoon, men would gather for a game of pool. They would sit around a shabby table looking strange in the open air, while women washed their hair in iced water of a small stream which flowed all the way to his guest house. Darchin had no pilgrims, which were a setback for him. I had been told that at the height of the pilgrimage season, the town was bustling with visitors. Many brought their own accommodation, enlarging the settlement round its edges as they set up their tents, which spilled down on the plain. I had timed my arrival for the beginning of the season, but it seemed I was too early. The narrator told that in the peak season of pilgrimage, in this town was filled with visitors. In the peak season of pilgrims, it was filled with visitors. Some brought their own accommodations, such as tents which were set up in the plains. He felt that he had arrived at that place way too early. Next, one afternoon, I sat pondering my options over a glass of tea in Darchin's only cafe. After a little consideration, I concluded they were severely limited. Clearly, I hadn't made such progress with my self help program on positive thinking. Then, one day, while he was thinking about his options while having a glass of tea at Darchin's only cafe, he concluded that there are limited options for him as he made little progress on the self help program on positive thinking. In my defense, it had not been easy with all my sleeping difficulties, but however, I looked at it. I could only wait. And there, he said that he was having difficulty in sleeping, which had not made it easy for him. He had no option other than to wait until the peak season of pilgrimage. The pilgrimage trail was well trodden, but I didn't fancy doing it alone. The Kora was seasonal because parts of the route were liable to blockage by snow. I had no idea whether or not the snow had cleared, but I wasn't encouraged by the chunks of dirty ice that still clung to the banks of. And there he says that the, the trail was much frequented by the travelers. He could do Kora alone, but it was a seasonal session because of the route blockage by snow. He had no idea if the snow was cleared, and he was not feeling good about the dirty ice that still resides on the bank of Darchin's small stream. He had facing communication problems. Since Saturn had left, I didn't I hadn't come across anyone in Darchin with enough English to answer even this most basic question. Until that is, I met Norbu. Norbu is the another character of this story. The cafe was small, dark, and cavernous, with a long metal stove that ran down the middle. The walls and the ceiling were wreathed in sheets of multicolored plastic of the stripped variety. And there he said that no one knew much English to answer his basic question. He met Norbu in a cafe which was small, dark, and vast with long metal stove. The walls and ceilings were twisted in multicolored plastic sheets of different colored strips. It was made into a firm and big shopping bags which were sold over China and in many other countries of Asia and Europe. Broaded blue, red, and white, that is made into stout, voluminous shopping bags, sold all over China and in many other countries of Asia as well as Europe. As much plastic must rate as one of China's most successful exports along the Silk Road today. Governance means vast, and well trodden means much frequented by travelers. And then he talked about plastic bags, which are very popular in China and the continent Asia and Europe. Plastics was China's successful export along the Silk Road. And the cafe had a single window beside which I had taken up position so that I could see the pages of my notebook. I had also brought a novel with me to help pass the time. And then Norbu saw my book when he came in and asked with a gesture if he could sit opposite me at my writing table, you English. My writing table, you English? He inquired. After he had ordered tea, I told him I was, and we struck up a conversation. Then the cafe had only one window, which he would take so that he could see his notebook clearly, and he would also bring a novel with him to pass time. Norbu once saw his book and asked if he could see sit opposite him as it at his unstable table. He asked him if he is English after he ordered tea. He told him that he was English. I didn't think he was from those parts because he was wearing a wind cheater chatter and metal rimmed spectacles of a western style. He was Tibetan, he told me, but worked in Beijing at the Chinese Academy of Social Science in the Institute of Ethnic Literature. I assumed he was on some sort of field work. And then the narrator guessed that he must not be a local as he was wearing a wind cheater and metal rimmed spectacles which were of Western style. Norbu, who was a Tibetan but worked in Beijing at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the Institute of Ethnic Literature. Norbu told him that he had come from to do Kora. Yes and no, he said. I have come to do the Kora. My heart jumped. Norbu had been writing academic papers about the Kailash Kora and its importance in various works of Buddhist literature for many years, he told me, but he had never actually done it himself. Norbu was writing academic papers on Kailash Kora and its importance in various Buddhist literature works. He had never done the Kora himself. Further, when the time came for me to tell him what brought me to Darchen, his eyes lit up. We could be a team, he said excitedly. Two academics who have escaped from the library. Perhaps my positive thinking strategy was working after all. Norbu, who was excited when he got to know why the narrator was at Darchen, he said they could be a team who are two academists who escaped from the library. The narrator believed his positive thinking strategy was working. My initial relief at meeting Norbu, who was also staying in the guest house, was tempered by the realization that he was almost as ill equipped as I was for the pilgrimage. He kept telling me how fat he was and how hard it was going to be. Very high up, he kept reminding me. So tiresome to walk. He wasn't really a practicing Buddhist. It transferred, but He had enthusiasm and he was, of course, Tibetan. Norbu was also staying at a guest house just like him, and Norbu was as ill equipped like him. Norbu kept telling him that he was too dull, boring, and tired to walk, and he was fat. Norbu was not a practicing Buddhist, he was an enthusiast. Although I originally envisaged making the trek in the company of devout believers, on reflection, I decided that perhaps Norwood would turn out to be the ideal companion. He suggested we hire some yaks to carry our luggage, which I interpreted as a good sign, and he had no intention of protesting prostrating himself all round the mountain. Not possible, he cried, collapsing across the table in hysterical laughter. It wasn't his style anyway, his tummy was too big. Originally, the narrator predicted that the trek would be good in a company of any deep believer, but he found Norbu to be an ideal partner. They decided to hire some yaks to carry their luggage, and he had no intention of lying down flat all over the mountain. Norbu finally said it is not possible for him, why he collapsed across the table, laughing hilariously. His tummy was too big. Here is the story finished. I hope you understand the story.